Well, that last song that Wade led's pretty special to me. When I was a little boy, a man named Clarence Overstreet, who came to church most of the time in a bow tie and a pair of overalls, who was a good song leader and learned music, did some teaching of music. He let me sit by him so I could learn the alto line on that last song. I could sing some alto when I was 10, just so y'all know. But every time I hear that song, I think of Brother Clarence Overstreet. And of course, a lot of songs we sing, we think of a lot of people, don't we? Because they bring back great memories to us. But I appreciate what he did for me and helped me in many ways. Well, it's good to be with you tonight, as I said, and it's good to have some guests with us. I want to mention a few things tonight that have to do with our work this year and our plans for this year. Before I get into my lesson tonight, I mentioned in the family report this morning about the Sunday series, we call it, on February the 18th. And I mentioned in there who we're going to have speaking for us, one that we're very familiar with and one we aren't. But I want to just mention those lessons to you. Brother Randy Little is going to speak for us, and also Brother Steve Cook. And Steve and Randy, along with two other men, did a series last week in Tuscaloosa for the church there on lessons that had to do with the workplace and Christians in the workplace and time management and have to do with family, some things that relate to those things. And the elders, really excluding Randy, because he wasn't the one who promoted it, but John and Mitch and I, as we talked about that, and Randy was in the meeting, we were encouraged by those lessons and have heard great things about those lessons. And so we thought that it would be good for all of us to hear these lessons. And I want to add a word about that. I appreciate the opportunity to speak to you about spiritual things. But when it comes to a workplace environment, I don't have a lot of perspective about that. My workplace is my office here. And a lot of things that go on in your workplace don't go on in my workplace. And that's most of the time, that's a good thing. But I think it's important for us to hear from other Christians who are engaged in workplace environments and hear their perspective. And many of you could share that kind of perspective. But I think one of the reasons why these lessons will be needed for us is because they have that perspective. And so I'm anxious personally to hear those things, and I think that they will be a great help to us. So I just want to remind you of that. Each of these men will speak once in the morning and then once in the evening. We'll have 4 lessons like we typically do, and we'll have more to say about the times of that a little later. But I just wanted you to be reminded that that will happen on Sunday, February the 18th. And then on Saturday, March the 3rd, when I talked to you about our plans for this year, I mentioned we were going to try to do a few things that we haven't done yet. We're going to have 2 events on Saturdays during the year, and March the 3rd will be the first of those. I like to call it Ladies Saturday in the Word. It's for ladies only. It's going to be from probably 9 to 11 or 11:30 on that Saturday morning. And ladies, I would like to highly recommend that you make sure you mark that morning off, and that you not only plan to be here, but that you invite as many ladies as you can to be here. And I'm going to encourage the ladies of all ages, high school young ladies, middle school, college. I would strongly encourage you to come. I have talked with a lady from Louisville named Joan Coffey. And Joan is one of the finest, frankly, she's just one of the finest Christian women I've ever known. She and her husband Larry are good friends of mine, as there are several of you in this audience. And Joan has agreed to come and teach that class for the ladies. And I would highly recommend that. So I want to go ahead and make sure you mark that on your calendars. That will be Saturday, March the 3rd here at the building that morning. So make sure that you are aware of that you plan to come to that. And again, invite other ladies to come and take part in it. I think it will be a very rewarding 2 hours spent in the study of God's Word. Next week, Beth and I will be in Florida. Lord willing, we're planning to leave Friday, and we'll be gone about a week. And in my place next Sunday, Brother Milton Harris will be speaking in the morning, and Brother Parker Mims is going to speak Sunday night. These 2 men I know that you will not only enjoy, but that you'll benefit from. And I appreciate their willingness to speak in my absence, and I know you will benefit greatly. As I said, Beth and I will be in Florida. I will be speaking while I'm gone 4 different times. So I won't be on any kind of vacation, but it will be enjoyable for us for a number of reasons. But I look forward to that. And I hope that you'll certainly keep us in your prayers as we're away from you. So those are some things I wanted to mention to you as we really started the lesson tonight. Well, I want to talk to you tonight about something that is really a part two. As we studied last week, my lesson tonight is really an extension, if you will, of the lesson last Sunday night on God's faithfulness. And it is a result of what we have said we're going to do in terms of each month taking two opportunities to talk about leaving a legacy. One of those lessons each month, as I've said, is going to have to do with the family. But the other of those lessons is going to have to do with some aspect of leaving a legacy in another area or another environment. And tonight particularly, I want to talk to you about this idea, legacy of joy in the midst of difficulty. I don't want to belabor these points, but there's so much to be said, I think, in Scripture about us talking about not only how we handle that, how we handle our adversity, but what we leave in terms of how we handle that and what people can see in us and the kind of influence that they can have. I want you to be turning to the book of Philippians, if you would, in the New Testament. We're going to be looking at that. While there are a lot of Bible characters that could be probably discussed and mentioned, that I think probably we could say leave a legacy of joy in the midst of difficulty. I think there is one that stands out. At least there's one that stands out to me, and that would certainly be the Apostle Paul. And we're going to look at one of his letters tonight. And so I'll ask you, if you would, to be following along as I read. I'm going to begin reading in Philippians 1 and verse 12. So if you would, follow along. He says, "But I want you to know, brethren, that the things which happened to me have actually turned out for the furtherance of the gospel, so that it has become evident to the whole palace guard and to all the rest that my chains are in Christ. And most of the brethren in the Lord, having become confident by my chains, are much more bold to speak the word without fear. Some indeed preach Christ even from envy and strife, and some also from goodwill. The former preach Christ from selfish ambition, not sincerely, supposing to add affliction to my chains, but the latter out of love, knowing that I am appointed for the defense of the gospel. Well, what then? Only that in every way, whether in pretense or in truth, Christ is preached, and in this I rejoice, yes, and will rejoice. For I know that this will turn out for my deliverance through your prayer and the supply of the Spirit of Jesus Christ, according to my earnest expectation and hope, that in nothing I shall be ashamed, but with all boldness as always, so now also Christ will be magnified in my body, whether by life or by death. For to me to live is Christ, and to die is gain. But if I live on in the flesh, this will mean fruit for my labor, yet what I shall choose I cannot tell. For I am hard pressed between the two, having a desire to depart and be with Christ, which is far better. Nevertheless, to remain in the flesh is more needful for you. And being confident of this, I know that I shall remain and continue with you all for your progress in joy of faith, that your rejoicing for me may be more abundant in Jesus Christ by my coming to you again. Only let your conduct be worthy of the gospel of Christ, so that whether I come and see you or am I absent, I may hear of your affairs, that you stand fast in one spirit, with one mind, striving together for the faith of the gospel, and not in any way terrified by your adversaries, which is to them a proof of perdition, but to you of salvation, and that from God. For to you it has been granted on behalf of Christ not only to believe in Him, but also to suffer for His sake, having the same conflict which you saw in me, and now here is in me." As we think about Paul, and I realize that his character is probably, other than Jesus himself, the Apostle Paul is probably talked about more than any other Bible character for a variety of reasons. And one of those is because of the sharp contrast that he lived in his life. And I think the fact that he left legacies that are quite extreme. Not all of them were good, but some of them are good. And I would say that in his life, he closed strong. I think the way he started his life, obviously, even as we discussed this morning and alluded to, that was not the way. Ultimately, he would have started his life. If he could have gone back, I think he would have. But he closed strong. And the passage we just read, while it isn't the last thing that he wrote, it probably is something that he wrote 3 or 4 years before his death. And the letter addressed to the Philippians is part of a group of letters that probably you're well aware, we sometimes call the prison epistles. They were written because he was in prison, probably in a Roman prison, and probably, as I mentioned this morning, probably under house arrest. And so he writes these letters. And I think the idea really of this letter particularly, and probably, and at least in some regard, all of the prison epistles, the idea of joy in the midst of difficulty is dominant. And the difficulties that Paul faced are documented a great deal in the letters that he writes. In the last 35 years of his life, he just faced so many difficulties. But joy in the midst of difficulty dominated those years as well. And Philippians, I think, is the letter that obviously best describes that. Well, let me cut right to the chase. As you think about what he went through, and as you think about all the difficulty he faces, I think the question we need to ask ourselves is, first of all, maybe how did he do that? But secondly, then what did he leave? What kind of legacy did he leave as a result of what he did? Well, turn over. Let's kind of talk about that for a few minutes. Turn over to the book of James, a little bit further on in the New Testament. James, the first chapter. And very interestingly, I think, as James begins his letter, really after he introduces the letter, he says in verse 2, "My brethren, count it all joy when you fall into various trials, knowing that the testing of your faith produces patience." James, if there was a New Testament letter that was similar to Proverbs in the Old Testament, it'd be James. And not because there's not some flow to it, but it appears as though James covers a variety of ideas and a variety of topics and a variety of things that he wants to get across to his readers, and he just kind of goes from one to the other. I don't know that there's a great deal of flow, and it's like when he finishes one, he starts another. But the very first thing he mentions, I think it's interesting. The very first thing right out of the chute, as we sometimes say that he says is, "My brethren, count it all joy when you fall into various trials." I think it's interesting that that's the first thing he said. After his brief introduction, that's what he says. Isn't that the great way to start a letter? You know, if you were going to write somebody a letter, isn't a great way to start by saying, you know, folks, what you need to do right off is you just need to count it all joy when you're going through these various trials. How many of us begin sympathy cards like that? "Dear Bill, we're glad you're going through this difficulty because it's going to make you better." How many of us would start any kind of thing like that? That would be a crazy way for us to start. Or "I'm thinking of you during this difficult time" card, and you start it that way. Well, none of us would do that. Well, James does that. And I think James also goes on to say in verse 3, "knowing that the testing of your faith produces patience." You know, whatever it is, and I think intellectually we all understand this. Whatever it is that we're going through, the purpose of that, James says, Jesus would say, and other inspired writers would say, the reason you're going through that, or maybe not the reason, but what it produces is something that's going to make you better. It's going to make you better. I think it's not just interesting, but I think it's right. In some conversations that I've had with Renee recently. Face-to-face conversations. You know, typically the way she ends those conversations is by saying this: "Whatever happens, it's going to make me better." I want you to think about that. And as difficult as that may be to actually always believe, I think that's what she knows. And it's not just her. It's anybody who faces these things. But I find it interesting because what she's saying is this. This is what she's saying. And while it may be difficult during the time that we go through it, what we know is that if we face these things, ultimately on the other side of this, there's going to be something better that awaits us. That's what these trials go through. That's what James says. And not only is it going to help us, I think this is important, but it's going to help those we're close to. It's going to help people in our family. I have no doubt that is difficult as some of the things that maybe even somebody like Renee goes through. But yet, as hard as it is on her family, on her children, on her husband, yet there's something that's going to come from that is strong. And that shows this is what faith does in the midst of this difficulty. And others of you who have gone through that, what you're saying is, I can get through this, and what you're saying to the rest of us is, that's the way you handle that. That's the way you accomplish. That's the way you deal with that. That's where you let faith produce this kind of patience. And you have the right spirit and the right attitude. And so I think that's how joy works. And that's how joy is produced when trials come our way. Well, what does it take to have that? Well, before I read about what it takes, let me tell you what it doesn't take. If you're going to have joy in trials, I'm going to suggest to us that you're going to have a perspective that's not horizontal. You know, when we have difficulties, if we're looking for answers out among us, that's going to be a hard place to find them, because we don't have answers. I don't know that anybody can give anybody who's facing difficulties, I don't know if anybody can just give them earthly answers. We don't have those kind of answers. As a matter of fact, we search for words to try to say to people who go through those difficulties, or we search for words to tell ourselves when we go through those difficulties. Because that's not where we find the comfort. And that's not where we build the legacy that says, I'm going through this, but what I want to say not only to myself, but to those who love me the most, this is what I'm going to say. This is how I'm going to handle it. So it does take a perspective that Paul talks about in 2 Corinthians 4. I want you to turn there if you would. Every time I talk about these verses, I'm sure I say to you, these are some of my favorite verses. I'm going to say it again. These are some of my favorite verses. And only within the past probably 10 years, maybe 15 years, have they come to mean, I think, something to me that maybe they didn't mean early in my life. And I think as we read them, I think you'll get it. I'm going to tell you something. I'm going to tell you something right now. If you're older in this audience, what I'm about to read is going to mean more to you than if you're younger. That's just the way this is. Now, I wish it didn't. But that's what's going to happen. I want you to read. I want you to follow. I'm beginning reading in verse 16. I could move on up earlier, but let's begin in verse 16. Listen to Paul. Therefore we do not lose heart, even though our outward man is perishing, yet the inward man is being renewed day by day. For our light affliction, which is but for a moment, is working for us a far more exceeding and eternal weight of glory, while we do not look at the things which are seen, but at the things which are not seen. But the things which are seen are temporary, but the things which are not seen are eternal. I just want you to think about those words. There is a perspective here, and I've mentioned this. There is a perspective here that I think it's not unique to the New Testament. But I think this may state it as well as any place that at least I'm aware of. And I've heard other authors say the same thing. This is where Paul really says, this is how you deal with life. You first of all understand that it's not about what's happening to me physically, it's about what's happening to me spiritually. And a person whose perspective is right, they're growing spiritually every day, regardless of what's going on in their physical bodies. Now, I told you, a younger person, it's not that you can't understand that, but it's going to be more difficult for you to understand that. Because what's going on in your physical bodies right now doesn't appear to be light momentary affliction. Most of you who are young, you don't have light momentary affliction. If you get hurt, you bounce back. If you have a disease, typically you bounce back. Now, that's not always the case, but that's typically the case. But the word bounce back is typically not in an older person's vocabulary. We just don't bounce back. Notice I say we. We just don't bounce back. And it's because the perspective begins to change. But yet, while there's so much here, and again, I get a little overwhelmed because there's so much that we could say about this. But just notice that this renewal, this spiritual renewal, ought to take place every day for someone who has the right attitude and right perspective. That's what verse 16 says. But notice verse 17. For our light affliction, which is but for a moment, is working for us a far more exceeding and eternal weight of glory. You know what verse 17 screams, and yet the word's not even mentioned? Joy. The word's not mentioned. But what verse 17 really saying is there's joy in my life because what I'm going through, I look at not as something that's devastating, but I look at something that's producing, what does he say? It's working for us a far more exceeding and eternal weight of glory. Now, what kind of person even views the problems in this life like that? I'll tell you, the only person who can is a person that has a right perspective. It's the only person who can. A person with an earthly, horizontal perspective, you can't see what's going on in your life this way. You can't see it because you don't have that perspective. You need the vertical perspective, and that's what he says. What's going on in my life is working. It's really momentary. That's the word he uses. It's just for a moment. And it's working for us a far more exceeding and eternal weight of glory. That's interesting. That whole concept is interesting because we don't fully understand that. A far more exceeding and eternal weight of glory. If you've got that defined in your head, then you're a lot better at it than I am. I think that's his point to use those terms. He's saying you cannot imagine how much better it's going to be. If I see how my light affliction is working for me, then I accept my circumstance or circumstances with joy. I know that's hard to think about. But, I don't know if this is the right way to say this, but I'm going to say it anyway. That's my best option. You may say, well, there are really not any good options. Well, yes, there are. I'll tell you the best option, and the good option is you think about what you're going through as something that's working for you a far more exceeding and eternal weight of glory. Right? That's how we view that. And when we do that, we're not only helping ourselves get through it, but we're helping others. We're leaving for them a legacy that says, you know, now that I'm going through this, I remember how somebody else handled it. I know I have mentioned Eunice Cobb to you at least one time since I've been here. Eunice Cobb died when she was 100 years old. She became one of my dearest friends on earth. And part of that was because there was a several-year period where we would pick her up for services. She lived in a home, as you might expect, and she wanted to go. Her mind was good. Physically, for the most part, up until she died, she was able to go. And I always loved talking to her. First of all, because she talked about President Woodrow Wilson like she knew him. And I talked to her about various things that happened in history and we would talk about various things that happened in the church and just various things in her life that had changed. And you can imagine when she died several years ago, a woman that old, I think she had died. I'm not sure exactly when she had died, but it was amazing just to talk to her. But I can remember going into her room to pick her up, to put her in her wheelchair, to help her get in her wheelchair, and then to wheelchair her out. And her come to services and put her back in the wheelchair and take her back where she was. And she knew where she lived. And while I didn't see a lot of joy there, and frankly, there wasn't a lot of things in her circumstance that would make me think, man, this is a good place. I think there were some things that were good about it. Don't get me wrong. But she never complained about it. She never complained about it when I think she probably could have complained about it. She never complained about family who was living in the area who probably, at least in my judgment, but my judgment may be wrong, but who at least in my judgment probably didn't come to see her as often as they could have or should have, and probably tend to her as much as they needed to. But she never complained about it, because she spent her time listening to tapes. That's cassette tapes. That's anyway. And she'd want me to bring her, she'd say, take these and bring me more. Take these and bring me more. And there were many times when I'd go in and she'd be listening to sermons. Occasionally there'd be some of mine. But she'd be listening to those, and she never complained. And I'll tell you what, if you come to my office right now, you're going to see 2 pictures of her, because I loved her. And a lot of the pictures in my office are I love those people, but I love them for specific reasons. And one of the reasons that I love Eunice Cobb is because she lived her life with joy. And those afflictions that did afflict her in those last many years of her life were afflictions that she saw as light. And she left a legacy for me. I remember her. That's what she left me. She accepted her circumstances with joy. 2 Corinthians 5 says this. I love this too. This is beginning in verse 1. This really the same thought. Paul would say, for we know that if our earthly house, this tent, is destroyed, we have a building from God, a house not made with hands, eternal in the heavens. For in this we groan, earnestly desiring to be clothed with our habitation, which is from heaven. If indeed, having been clothed, we shall not be found naked, for we who are in this tent groan, being burdened, not because we want to be unclothed, but further clothed, that mortality may be swallowed up by life. Now he who has prepared us for this very thing is God, who also has given us the Spirit as a guarantee. So we are always confident, knowing that while we're at home in the body, we're absent from the Lord, for we walk by faith and not by sight. We're confident, yes, well pleased rather to be absent from the body and to be present with the Lord. One reason that light affliction can be looked at this way is because there will come a time that we're going to be clothed with an immortal body. That has to do with eternity and the change that Paul talks about in 1 Corinthians 15. How we're going to be, our bodies are going to be changed. I don't understand all that. I don't begin to tell you that I understand all that. But I believe our bodies are going to be changed into something that's incorruptible. That's what Paul tells us. And I think for those who suffer even in this life in bodily form, whether you're young or old, you can look forward to a day when your body is going to be changed. And as he says in verse 1 of 2 Corinthians 5, for we know. That's a key. We know. There's no guesswork or wishful thinking or hope against hope. We know. It's not if we know. It's not if we think. It's not maybe he will. It's for we know. And verse 8 tells us we are confident, yes, well pleased. These words are not about elusiveness or uncertainty or doubting. These words are about confidence that says this is what's going to happen to me. So back to this idea of leaving a legacy in the midst of difficulty. Turn back to Philippians 4 if you would, please. Turn back to Philippians 4. Let me close tonight with these verses and a couple of comments about them. Philippians 4 beginning in verse 10. But I rejoiced in the Lord greatly that now at last your care for me has flourished again. Though you surely did care, but you lacked opportunity. Now that I speak in regard, not that I speak in regard to need, for I have learned in whatever state I am to be content. I know how to be abased and I know how to abound. Everywhere and in all things I have learned both to be full and to be hungry, both to abound and to suffer need. And then he says this, I can do all things through Christ who strengthens me. Verse 14 says, nevertheless, you have done well that you shared in my distress. At the close of this letter, I think Paul is saying, I hope that what I'm leaving for you is something that as you read it and as you think about my circumstances and as you know me and as you know what I'm going through, I think he's saying, This just didn't happen. I just didn't wake up one day and say, this is how I'm going to look at this. Matter of fact, he says, this is what I have learned. He says in verse 11, not that I speak in regard to need, for I have learned. Something that he learned. That in whatever state I am, I've learned to be content. I know how, he says, I know how to abound and I know how to be abased. And so he's learned something that I think he's not only grateful for because it allowed him to live the kind of life that he did, because he was imprisoned in several places for extended period of times. And he learned how to handle that. Now, that's not the same thing necessarily as disease, but he no doubt faced some of that and faced some difficulties like that. And then he says in verse 13, I can do all things through Christ who strengthens me. I don't want to make more of this, but that's not saying I can do all things. Because you can't do all things. And people who say, just whatever you want to do, you can do that. No, that's not what that's saying. I think in the context, what that's saying is that when you face difficulties, you can do all things. Because it's Christ who strengthens you. That's what Paul's saying. That's what this context says. And so I think Paul is reassuring probably himself as much as those who would read this and those of us who would later read this. I think Paul is saying, you know what? This is the lesson that I've learned. And if I can help somebody else overcome and understand that, then I have left something for them that will help them face adversity in the midst of difficulty. Well, over the past several weeks, we talked about this a lot. We've touched on various aspects of these things. And I think that's the part of why we've done it is I think we have been a bit overwhelmed. This entire church, our church family, I think has been a bit overwhelmed by these kinds of things that we've talked about. It's not that this is the first time that's happened, because this church, like every church, like people everywhere, have faced those kind of things in their lives. But I think for us to go back and be reminded that we not only understand how God wants us to handle that, but it shows the strength that we can have so that when people look at us, they can say, I remember how he handled that, or I remember how she handled that. I am at a point in time in my life where what I think my kids will remember about me is really important. I think about it every day. And sometimes when I think about it, I feel pretty good. And then sometimes when I think about it, I don't feel pretty good. And it's a very sobering time. I don't think, it's not that I've reached the magic age. I don't think it's that at all. And I don't know if it just happens. Those of you who are my age or older or younger, maybe you can help me with that. But that's I'm just telling you how I feel. But I think it's important for us to be mindful of what our lives are saying to those we have influence over. I would hope that how I face difficulties or how I face other circumstances in my life, I would hope that would have some positive influence over you. If you say, well, I watch Kenny, I notice how he's handling that, or I notice how he's dealing with it. And I'll tell you this, the same happens from me to you. I watch you. I know you, I talk with you, and I listen to you. And a lot of you, most of you, really all of you who have faced these kind of difficulties, you have taught me some great lessons that I'm pretty confident that I'm going to be called on at some point in my life to try to implement. And much of what I hope that I can accomplish, I hope and pray that I can do it, that I could accomplish as a result of watching you and watching how you've handled those things in the midst of difficulty. The human experience is hard. I think that's one reason why We ought to long for heaven. And we ought to look forward to the day when our spiritual body or our physical bodies will be given up and our spiritual bodies will be changed and we'll be with God forever. There's just no way to describe it. And even though the writers try to, there's no way to fully understand it. But it's going to be better than we could ever imagine. But we got to get there. And we got to get there through the midst of difficulties that happens to us. I hope we can accomplish that very much. If you're here tonight and we can help you with a spiritual need that you might have, we want to do that. We're always interested in that. And so as Wade leads us in this song, if we can assist you in that, let it be known by coming forward.